My son's second wife looked at me across the anniversary dinner table, smiled with all her teeth, and said, "Maybe it's time you start thinking about a retirement home, Frank. You're not exactly easy to have around anymore." I set my fork down, folded my napkin, and said, "You're right. I'll go tonight." She had no idea I already owned the building she just booked for her spa weekend, and by morning, she'd be begging me to answer my phone. My name is Frank Delaney. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, I thought the worst thing that could happen to a man was outliving his wife. I found out 3 years ago that I was wrong. The worst thing is watching your only son hand your family's future to someone who never once asked what it cost to build it. I grew up outside Pittsburgh, the son of a steelworker who lost 2 fingers on the line and never once complained about it in front of me. My wife Carol and I met in a laundromat when we were both 22 and broke, and we spent the next 41 years building something out of nothing. First a hardware store, then a second one, then a small chain of them across 3 counties, then real estate. Because a man learns pretty quickly that the person who owns the building outlasts the person who just rents the register. Carol handled the books. I handled the people. We raised one son, Michael, in a house with a leaky roof we didn't fix until we could pay cash for it, because that was the rule Carol and I lived by. You don't borrow your way into a life you haven't earned yet. Carol passed 8 years ago. Cancer, fast and merciless. The kind that doesn't give you time to say the things you meant to say for 40 years. Michael was 31 then, already married to his first wife, a quiet, kind woman named Diane, who used to bring me soup every Sunday for the first year after Carol died, just so I wouldn't eat alone. Diane and Michael divorced 2 years later. I never asked why. I had my suspicions, and those suspicions had a name: Renata. Renata came into Michael's life like weather, sudden, dramatic, impossible to ignore. She was 11 years younger than him, worked in what she called luxury brand consulting, and drove a car that cost more than my first house. The first time I met her, at a restaurant Michael picked because he said I liked the atmosphere, she looked at my flannel shirt and my work boots and asked, with what I think she believed was a friendly laugh, if I'd come straight from a job site. I told her I had in fact spent that morning walking a construction site I owned, and she laughed again, louder, like I'd made a joke. She never asked what I meant. People who assume they already know the answer rarely do. For the next 3 years, I watched my son become someone I didn't fully recognize. He started correcting the way I dressed. He started apologizing for me before I'd even done anything. At Renata's sister's wedding, he asked me, quietly, in the parking lot, if I owned a sport coat that wasn't from the 90s. I told him I owned 12 of them, and I'd worn the same charcoal one to Carol's funeral, and I'd wear whatever coat I chose to wear until somebody buried me in it. He didn't bring it up again, but I saw the flicker of embarrassment cross his face, and something in my chest went cold and stayed that way. What Michael and Renata never understood, because I never told them, was the actual size of what I'd built. The hardware chain was the visible part, the part everyone could see and make assumptions about. Underneath it was a holding company, Delaney Property Group, that had spent 30 years quietly buying commercial real estate across the state, strip malls, office parks, and, as it happened, a chain of boutique wellness resorts I'd acquired 6 years earlier from a man who'd overextended himself and needed out fast. I don't advertise what I own. I learned that from my father, who used to say that a loud dog gets kicked and a quiet one gets fed. I wore flannel because flannel doesn't itch and doesn't need dry cleaning, not because I couldn't afford silk. Michael married Renata on a Saturday in October, and I paid for the wedding without being asked, the way I'd paid for nearly everything in his adult life without ever being thanked for it. Not because I expected gratitude, because that's what a father does. What I did expect, foolishly, was basic respect at his 40th birthday dinner the following spring, which Renata had organized at a private dining room downtown, the kind of place where the menu doesn't list prices. I arrived early, because I always arrive early. A habit from 40 years of opening a store at 6 a.m., whether I felt like it or not. Renata was already there, directing the staff with the brisk, imperious energy of a woman used to being obeyed. When she saw me, she looked me over the same charcoal jacket, a little more worn now, the same boots, and said, loud enough for the arriving waitstaff to hear, "Oh, Frank. We talked about this. It's a nice restaurant." I told her I was aware, and that I'd chosen my clothes accordingly. She rolled her eyes and walked away without responding, which I'd come to understand was her version of ending a conversation she'd already decided she'd won. Michael arrived 20 minutes later, kissed his wife, shook my hand like I was a business associate rather than his father, and spent the next hour laughing at jokes I wasn't part of, at a table where I'd paid for the wine before anyone had asked me to. Halfway through the appetizers, Renata leaned toward her sister and said, not quietly enough, Michael's been so stressed about the house situation. His father could fix it in 5 minutes if he weren't so cheap. I didn't respond. I'd learned by then that responding only fed her. The house situation, as it turned out, was this. Michael and Renata wanted to buy a 5-bedroom colonial in a neighborhood I knew well because Delaney Property Group had developed half the retail strip 2 blocks from it. The house was $1.4 million. They had, between them, less than a tenth of that in savings. Most of it Michael's, all of it a fraction of what Renata spent annually on things I couldn't begin to name. Michael had asked me for a loan 2 weeks earlier, not a gift. He'd been careful to say, a loan, with interest, properly documented. I'd said I needed time to think about it, which was true. I was still thinking about the pattern I'd started to notice, the way every conversation with my son now seemed to end with a number attached. Dessert came, and with it, the moment that changed everything. Renata tapped her glass with a spoon, stood, and announced that she wanted to share something before the night ended. She talked about how much she loved Michael, how excited she was for their future together, how she hoped that future included everyone at this table growing more comfortable with change. Then she looked directly at me. Frank, I know this is hard to hear, but Michael and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for you to consider some other living arrangements. You're getting older. The house is a lot for one person. There are wonderful communities now, very upscale, where you'd be looked after, and honestly, Frank, it would take a lot of pressure off Michael. He worries about you constantly, and frankly, it's exhausting for both of us. I looked at my son. I waited for him to say something, anything, the way I'd waited in 100 smaller moments over the past 3 years for him to draw a line and stand on my side of it. He looked at his plate. He said nothing. That silence told me more than any insult Renata could have delivered, because Renata was a stranger to me in a way my son could never be, and a stranger's cruelty doesn't break you the way your own child's cowardice does. I set my fork down. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate, the way Carol taught me, edges square. You're right, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. It probably is time for a change. I'll go tonight. Renata's face lit up with something close to triumph, like she'd expected a fight and was pleasantly surprised to be spared one. That's very mature of you, Frank, she said. I actually already booked myself a little spa weekend to celebrate, starting tomorrow, Cedar Hollow Retreat. Do you know it? It's supposed to be incredible. I told her I was familiar with it. She smiled and moved on to describing the mud treatments, and I let her, because there was no version of that sentence I could say aloud that wouldn't have ruined the surprise I hadn't yet decided to give her. Cedar Hollow Retreat is the flagship property of the wellness chain I'd bought 6 years earlier. I own it outright, along with the 4 sister locations across the state. Renata had just told me, with her chin up and her champagne in hand, that she planned to spend her celebratory weekend inside a building where my name is on the deed, unaware that the man she just tried to discard owned the ground beneath her feet. I drove home that night in the same truck I'd owned for 9 years, the one Renata had once called an eyesore in front of a valet. I didn't turn on the radio. I sat with the silence and let it settle into my chest, the way silence does when a decision has already been made somewhere underneath your thinking, before your thinking has caught up to it. I wasn't angry, not in the hot way I might have expected. I was calm, in the particular way a man gets calm right before he stops asking for something he spent years hoping to receive. I want to be honest about something. For 3 years, I had made excuses for both of them. I told myself Renata was young and hadn't learned yet what it cost to build a life from nothing. I told myself Michael was caught in the middle, trying to keep peace between the woman he loved and the father he'd always respected, and that his silence was weakness, not betrayal. I told myself these things because the alternative that my son had simply chosen comfort over character, chosen his wife's approval over his father's dignity, was too painful to sit with. That night in the truck, I stopped making excuses. A man can only absorb so many small humiliations before he understands that they were never small at all. They were a slow erosion, and he'd mistaken his own patience for their kindness. I got home, made a pot of coffee I didn't drink, and called Grant Whitfield, my attorney and closest friend of nearly 30 years. Grant had helped me structure Delaney Property Group from the beginning. He knew every asset I owned better than I did in some cases. Grant, I said when he picked up, sounding groggy. I need you to pull the file on Cedar Hollow, and I need to know exactly what's on the books for Michael's house situation. There was a pause. Frank, it's 11 at night. I know, I said. I've got a busy morning. Renata arrived at Cedar Hollow the next afternoon. According to the check-in log, the front desk manager, a woman named Priya, who'd worked for me for 4 years and knew exactly who signed her paycheck, emailed me without my even asking. Renata had booked the Ridgeview Suite, the property's best room, and a full weekend of treatments, the deep tissue, the mud wrap, the signature Cedar Hollow facial, that cost more than most people's monthly car payment. She checked in under her own name, gave her card for incidentals, and according to Priya, was extremely particular. With the front desk staff within the first 10 minutes complaining that her room didn't face the mountain the way she'd requested. I didn't go there myself. I didn't need to. I called Priya back and gave her 3 instructions, calm and clear, the way I give every instruction that matters. First, every staff member was to treat Mrs. Delaney with total professional courtesy for the remainder of her stay, no exceptions. Regardless of anything she said or did, I would not have my employees pay for my family's dysfunction. Second, I wanted a full accounting of every charge on her folio by the end of the weekend. Third, and this was the part that mattered, I told Priya that on Sunday morning, before checkout, I wanted her to personally deliver an envelope to Renata's room. I would have it couriered to the property that evening. That envelope contained 2 things. The first was a printed copy of the deed to Cedar Hollow Retreat with Delaney Property Group listed as the sole owner and my name beneath it as managing partner. The second was a single handwritten note. It read, "Enjoy the mud wrap. It's on the house. Some houses, you don't get to choose who lives in them. Frank." While Renata was 50 miles away getting a hot stone massage from a building she didn't know I owned, I spent Saturday doing something I should have done a year earlier. I called Grant back to my office, the small one above the original hardware store, the one with the metal desk Carol picked out in 1987 that I've never bothered replacing. I asked him to run a complete, formal financial review, not of Michael's household income, which I already understood, but of the joint accounts Michael shared with Renata, the mortgage pre-approval they'd applied for using my name as a reference without asking me first, and the spending patterns on the credit cards I discovered. To my genuine shock, I was still technically a co-signer on from years earlier, back when Michael was 26 and just starting out, and I'd wanted to give him a foothold. Grant called me back that evening with a tone I recognized from decades of doing business together, the tone he uses when the numbers are worse than either of us expected. "Frank," he said, "you're not going to like this." He was right. I didn't. The credit card I'd co-signed on 11 years ago, meant to help a young man establish credit history while he built his career, had a current balance of $34,000. It had been maxed for at least 8 months. The minimum payments, Grant discovered, were being made not from Michael's income, but from a separate account Renata controlled, funded partly by her consulting income and partly, troublingly, by transfers from an account labeled in the bank's internal records as a family trust distribution money that had originated from a modest trust I'd set up for Michael when he was born, meant to mature when he turned 50, meant to be a retirement cushion, not a shopping account. Someone had petitioned the trust administrator for an early hardship distribution 18 months earlier. The signature on that petition was Michael's. The person who'd notarized it, according to the paperwork, was a notary whose office was 2 doors down from Renata's employer. I sat with that for a long time. Not the debt. Debt happens to good people, and I've forgiven worse from better men. What sat heavy in my chest was the timeline. 18 months of hardship distributions from a trust his mother had insisted we set up, using her maiden name as the trust title, a small tribute Carol had asked for, and I'd never once mentioned to Michael because I wanted it to be a genuine surprise, a piece of his mother waiting for him when he was old enough to need it. He drained it to cover a lifestyle his wife had built, and he hadn't had the spine to say no to. And 2 nights earlier, that same wife had stood in a restaurant I'd paid for and suggested I move into a retirement home so I'd stop being exhausting. I called Michael on Sunday morning while Renata was still an hour from checkout, still unaware that the peaceful, professional service she'd received all weekend had been personally curated by the man she tried to discard. I kept my voice level. "Michael," I said, "I need you to come by the house today." "Alone?" He asked why, And I heard the particular nervousness in his voice that told me some part of him already suspected this conversation was overdue. Because it's time we talked honestly about your mother's trust, I said, and I let the silence that followed do the rest of the work. He arrived at 4 that afternoon, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he came without Renata trailing behind him, without checking his phone every 90 seconds for her texts. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I sat him down at the kitchen table, the same one Carol and I bought secondhand in 1985, and I laid out the documents Grant had pulled together: the credit card statements, the trust distribution petition, the forged-looking signature that I still, even then, wanted to believe was a misunderstanding rather than what it plainly was. "Dad," he started, and his voice cracked on the word in a way I hadn't heard since he was 14 and had wrecked my truck the first month he had his license. "I can explain all of this." I told him I was listening, and I meant it, because whatever else had happened, he was still my son, and I owed him the chance to be a man about it before I decided what came next. What he told me over the next hour was a story I'd half suspected but hadn't let myself fully believe. Renata's spending had spiraled almost from the start of their marriage, not reckless in an obvious dramatic way, but constant, relentless. $1,000 here on a handbag, $3,000 there on a girl's trip. She insisted was necessary for her career networking, the kind of bleeding that doesn't look catastrophic in any single moment, but adds up to catastrophe over 3 years. Michael had been too proud, or too afraid, to tell her no. Because every time he tried, she made him feel small, made him feel like questioning her spending was questioning her love for him. So instead of confronting her, he'd started quietly patching the holes, first with savings, then with the credit card, and finally, 18 months ago, panicking over a payment he couldn't make. He'd found the paperwork for his mother's trust in my old filing cabinet during a visit, and instead of asking me, he'd taken the account number, forged a hardship letter, and had it notarized by a contact of Renata's, who apparently didn't ask many questions. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. What Michael did was wrong, and it was a crime. Not a mistake. Forging a signature on a legal financial document is fraud regardless of who the victim is or how much you love them. But sitting across from him that afternoon, watching him finally tell me the truth without his wife in the room to perform for, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. My son wasn't cruel. He was weak, and he'd let someone else's cruelty use him as a delivery system. Those are different failures, and they deserve different responses, but neither one is free of consequence. "You stole from your mother," I told him, and I watched that land harder than any of the financial figures had. "Not from me, from her. That money had her name on it because I wanted a piece of her waiting for you long after I'm gone, and you sold it to cover for a woman who, 2 nights ago, sat at a table I paid for and told me I should be put away somewhere so I'd stop being an inconvenience." He put his head in his hands. He didn't argue. I think, in that moment, some of the fog he'd been living in for 3 years finally cleared, and he saw the whole shape of what he'd allowed himself to become. I told him what was going to happen next, and I want you to understand that I didn't decide it out of anger, though I certainly had reason for that. I decided it because a man who loves his son doesn't let him keep drowning just because the water is more comfortable than the shore. I told him the trust fraud stopped immediately. I would not be filing charges against my own son, not because he didn't deserve consequences, but because I believed, and still believe, that the right consequence here wasn't a courtroom. It was the truth, delivered all at once, with nowhere left to hide from it. I told him the $34,000 credit card debt was his to solve, not mine, and that I was formally removing myself as co-signer effective that week, which Grant had already begun the paperwork for. I told him the house, the $1.4 million colonial he and Renata wanted, was never going to happen with my money. Not now, not ever. And that if he wanted to know why, he should ask his wife where 18 months of his inheritance had gone. And I told him something else, something I decided sometime between Friday night's dinner and that Sunday afternoon at my kitchen table. Delaney Property Group's holding structure included the Strip retail complex where Renata's consulting firm leased its office space, a lease, as it happened, that was up for renewal in 60 days. "I'm not going to hurt her business out of spite," I told him, and I meant it. "But I am done pretending I don't own what I own. And I am done letting either of you believe you can insult me at a dinner table and then rely on the very things I built to keep your life comfortable." If she wants a lease renewal on favorable terms from Delaney Property Group, she can start by explaining to me, in person, why my late wife's trust fund financed her lifestyle for a year and a half. Michael left that evening a different man than he'd arrived, and I don't say that lightly. He hugged me at the door, the first real hug in longer than I could count, and he said, "I don't know how to fix this, Dad." I told him that was finally an honest thing to say, and that fixing it would take longer than either of us wanted, and that the first step was going home and telling his wife the truth about where he'd been all afternoon. Renata called me herself the following Tuesday. Not Michael Renata. I let it ring twice before I answered. The way I always do, a habit from a lifetime of not letting anyone hear the eagerness in my voice. "Frank," she said, and her tone had changed entirely from the woman at the birthday dinner, from the woman who'd left me a passive-aggressive note about my clothing choices in a group text 6 months earlier. This voice was careful, frightened even. Underneath the practiced smoothness, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding about the lease at my office, and I wanted to talk to you directly, one-on-one. I told her I was happy to talk, and that I had exactly one question for her before we discussed anything else. Did she know where the money for the last 18 months of her spa memberships, her handbags, and her girls' trips had actually come from? The silence on the other end of that line told me everything the trust paperwork already had. She tried, for a while, to talk her way around it first, claiming she didn't manage the household finances closely, which contradicted 3 years of watching her hover over every receipt Michael brought home. Then claiming Michael had told her the money came from a family investment maturing, which might even have been technically true, in the way a lie can wear the clothes of a half-truth if you dress it carefully enough. I let her talk. I've learned that people reveal more in their explanations than they ever would if you simply accuse them outright. "Renata," I finally said, "I didn't call you to argue about a lease. I called because I want you to hear this from me directly. Not through my son, not through a lawyer's letter. Your husband forged a legal document to drain his late mother's trust fund because he was too afraid of your reaction to tell you no. That is not a debt problem. That is what happens when a marriage is built on one person's fear of disappointing the other. I don't know what you two decide to do about that. That's your business, not mine. But I want you to understand something clearly. I built everything you've enjoyed for the last 3 years with 40 years of work you know nothing about, and I did it wearing the same flannel shirts you've mocked at every family dinner since the day we met. You told me in front of my son, at a table I paid for, that it was time for me to disappear into a facility so I'd stop inconveniencing you. I want you to sit with the fact that the weekend after you said that, you spent 2 nights inside a building I own, treated with more warmth and respect by my employees than you have ever once shown me, because unlike you, they didn't know who I was and treated me with basic human decency anyway. That should tell you something about the difference between the two of us." She didn't have anything to say to that. For the first time since I'd met her, Renata Delaney was quiet. The following month unfolded slowly, the way real consequences usually do, not in one dramatic scene, but in 100 smaller ones that accumulate into something permanent. Michael moved out of the house he shared with Renata for 6 weeks, staying in my guest room, sleeping in the same bed Carol used to keep made up for visiting cousins, working with Grant to untangle the credit card debt through a structured repayment plan he insisted on doing himself, without my money, because, he told me one night over dinner, "I think I need to know I can actually fix something on my own before I let you help me with anything else." I didn't argue with him. I think that was the first genuinely adult thing he'd said to me in 3 years. Renata's lease came up for renewal, and I let Grant handle the negotiation exactly the way we would have handled it for any other tenant. No favors, no punishment, market rate, standard terms. I didn't need to be cruel. The truth had already done more damage to her carefully built image than I ever could have, because word travels in small business communities the way water finds a crack, and I later heard, secondhand, that at least 2 of her consulting clients had quietly ended their contracts after hearing pieces of the story from mutual acquaintances. I never confirmed the details, and I never asked. That wasn't a door I needed to walk through. Michael and Renata are still married, as of this telling, though I'd be lying if I said I believed it would last. Some things don't announce themselves loudly: the wine on the tablecloth, the joke at your expense, the trust fund quietly emptied, but they add up in a ledger somewhere, the same way a business does, and eventually the ledger comes due regardless of how long you manage to avoid looking at it. What I know for certain is that my son sat across from me at that same kitchen table 2 weeks ago, without being asked, and told me he'd started seeing a counselor on his own, to understand, in his words, why it took losing my mother's money to finally hear what you'd been trying to tell me for 3 years. I don't know exactly where his marriage goes from here. That's not my decision to make, and I've made my peace with that. What I do know is this. I never moved into a retirement community. I still live in the house Carol and I bought in 1979, the one with the roof we didn't fix until we could pay for it outright. I still wear the same flannel shirts and the same worn boots, because comfort isn't a costume you wear for other people's approval. It's a way of telling the truth about who you actually are underneath everything you've built. Cedar Hollow Retreat is doing better than ever this year. I expanded the culinary training program there last spring, offering free certification courses to young people from the same kind of working neighborhoods I grew up in, because Carol always said the point of building something is to leave a door open behind you for the next person trying to climb through. I think about that dinner sometimes, the one where Renata stood up with her glass raised and suggested it was time for me to disappear quietly into the background of my own family's life. I think about how certain she was, how confident, standing in a restaurant I'd paid for, wearing jewelry that likely traced back, in some roundabout way, to money that once belonged to a woman who used to bring me soup on Sundays so I wouldn't grieve alone. I've learned something in 68 years that I didn't fully understand until that night in my truck, sitting in silence, deciding not to argue with a woman who'd already decided who I was before she ever asked. Respect isn't something you can demand from people who've already made up their minds about your worth based on the shirt on your back. It's something you protect, quietly, the same way you protect anything valuable, not by proving it to people who never intended to see it, but by refusing to hand it to anyone who asks you to disappear in exchange for their comfort. I gave my son everything I had for 31 years, and I would do it again without hesitation, because that's what love costs, and I never once resented paying it. But I stopped, finally, giving pieces of myself to people who mistook my patience for permission. That's the lesson this whole ordeal taught me. Sitting in that quiet kitchen with the son I nearly lost in some smaller but real way, got back. If you've ever sat at a table where the people you loved most made you feel like the inconvenience instead of the foundation, I want you to know you're not required to keep shrinking just to keep the peace. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for the people who've wronged you is step back and let the truth of what they've built or what they've torn down finally catch up to them in its own time. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever had to draw a line with your own family, I'd like to hear how you found the strength to hold it.